Hola, buen dia. It's me, Peppermint. And when I'm not on RuPaul's Drag Race or simply being New York City's sweetest diva, I'm tuned into the fabulously empowering Bayard Rustin Center for Social Justice Power Hour, coming to you every weeknight at 7 p.m. live from our good old friends at the BRCSJ Virtual HQ via their Facebook page. Tune in tonight.
Need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers.
Social justice, power hour, power hour, power hour. Social justice, power hour, power hour, power hour.
Good evening to our friends on the East Coast. Good afternoon to our friends in the West, and good in-between time to those of you in those in-between spaces, which we all find ourselves these days, my friends. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Social Justice Power Hour. Welcome to the virtual headquarters of the Bayard Rustin Center for Social Justice. My name is Robert Schreiber. I am the chief activist here at the center, and your host for this evening, as I have been for the past year and 8 months. We have done this power hour every single weeknight. Over 400 some odd shows, many of them very odd indeed. And it's been an extraordinary experience. And we want to thank you, as always, for joining us in virtual communion tonight. It is an honor and a thrill to welcome our guest, Adam Gopnik, with us. Adam came on the show almost a year ago, maybe even over a year ago at this point. I think we celebrated an anniversary. And then became a regular guest, and it's extraordinary, because I truly believe that Adam is one of the greatest thinkers of our modern generation, and it's just a thrill that he chooses to come here and ruminate and talk about all those things that are going through that fabulous, wonderful, extraordinary mind of his. So you're in for a treat tonight. It's going to be quite the conversation. I've been trying to keep my synapses resting all day so I could have them firing at full power tonight to try to just to keep up at half speed with Adam. But before we start, I do want to share with you some of the things that are coming up on the Power Hour. So as I said at the outset, we are here at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific every single freaking weeknight. So we do hope that you'll come back and join us. We are here for you. Please be here with us. Tomorrow night, we have something super special. We are doing Throwback Thursdays because, as I said, we've done over 400 of these shows. And we've had extraordinary folks drop by. And we want to kind of bring back some of those meaningful moments, some of those fabulous folks. And tomorrow night's really special to me. David Camp, author of Sunny Days, which is about the children's television revolution of the 70s, came to us on the eve of the paperback release of that book. And he brought with him, oh my gosh, Emilio Delgado, a.k.a. Luis from Sesame Street, and Bernadette Yao from Zoom. And what we thought was going to be a kind of a nostalgic, fun evening turned into something incredibly meaningful. So I beseech you to tune in tomorrow night for something super special. And if you saw it the first time, come back and see the subtle nuances. And if you missed it, then you're in for an absolute treat. And then follow it up. Oh my gosh, Friday is Jim Henson's birthday. And who better to be with us than Brian J. Jones? Jim Henson, the biographer, the author, one of the best biographers on the planet. And we're thrilled that he's coming back and he's going to share Jim Henson's top 10 social justice moments. So don't miss out, folks. And then coming up, Black Boy Joy, Kwame Mbalia is going to be with us celebrating Black Boy Joy. Nothing better, right? Gideon's Promise, a public defender movement to transform criminal justice. Jonathan Rappin is going to be here. Dante Stewart, this book is going to blow up. Shouting in the Fire. He was referred to us by the great Robert Jones Jr. We're so thrilled to have this conversation and to bring this new voice. Speaking of new voices, Charisma, I cannot wait to have her on the show. her poetry is fire, and she's going to do some poetry reading and some conversing. We're looking forward to that. The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World. Dave Zirin, who's also the sports editor of The Nation magazine. I tell you, we can't get better than this, right? Dr. Peniel Joseph, our beloved Bayard Rustin Center for Social Justice vice president of our board of directors here, will be here on the eve of his paperback release of The Sword and the Shield, the pivotal book about the relationship of Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, the dichotomy and the similarities that most folks don't know, and the untold stories. And Peniel is just one of the most fabulous folks I've ever met, or not met, but met enough here, right? And Queer Yoga, we do that every Tuesday night. Queer Yoga Master Jasmani brings us to virtual nirvana. Come to us, take a breath, both literally and figuratively. We all could use it. And speaking of those Throwback Thursdays, as I said, tomorrow night we have David Camp and his friends. We have Denise Froman from Poets from Puerto Rico. We have Dr. Eric Cervini, queer historian. April Rain, Oscars So White, and Amanda Jette Knox. Love lives here, the story of her transgender family. So come back and share all those meaningful moments we've shared before. And Wesley Stace, y'all, we have a big announcement coming up. An incredible musician. Some of you may know him from his previous incarnation as John Wesley Harding. Has a new album out called Late Style. It is blowing up, and we're so thrilled to announce we're going to have a live concert with him. So we're very excited about that, folks. And speaking of live concerts, last thing I want to talk about just for a hot minute, Jill Sobule, the fabulous Jill, our BRCSJ musician residence, will be live in concert here in Princeton. So if you live within like a 300-mile radius, if you live anywhere, Jill's coming from California, you can come out from wherever you are. This will be safe, masked, and vaxxed, only area appearance. We are going to have her here, and she is going to be doing this benefit concert for us. As many of you know, we lost our center, our physical space, and it's hard to be a safe space without a space during the pandemic. She's going to be here. All proceeds at this concert go toward finding us a new home. So come out, hear some fabulous music, meet a fabulous musician, and support our center. $25 gets you in the door. Another $25 gets you to the VIP after party. Last time Jill was here in July over the summer, we sold out quick. So buy your tickets now, buy them often, buy them early. Come out and do be with us. The comments, it's right there at kissedagirl.eventbrite.com. Don't miss it, folks. And that's just some of the highlights. Just some of the highlights coming up in the Power Hour. But gosh, that's not what you tuned in for tonight, and that's not what I tuned in for tonight either. I look forward to putting baby in the corner and just listening to our guest, because it's always such a thrill. Adam Gopnik has been writing for the New Yorker since 1986, even during his time in Paris when he wrote for the Paris Journal. Whilst there, he also wrote the delightful Paris to the Moon, Then Came the King in the Window, Through the Children's Gate, A Home in New York, Angels and Ages, a short book about Lincoln Darwin and modern life, Winter 5, Windows on the Season, The Table Comes First, and At the Stranger's Gate, Arrivals in New York, among many others, if you can believe it. His most recent work, A Thousand Small Sanities, The Moral Adventures of Liberalism, takes the form of a long letter to his daughter, and is one of the most thoughtful and thought-provoking things I have ever read, no doubt, no diggity. He has also worked on many musical projects, as well as a lyricist and a libretto writer, and not a bad guitar player at all. Adam has won 3 National Magazine Awards for essay and for criticism, and the George Polk Award for magazine reporting, as well as the Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters. Whew! I could literally spend the next hour alone sharing Adam's bona fides, but rather let's spend some time with the man himself, as he is literally one of my favorite people whom I have never actually met. And now, because of all that cool stuff I just mentioned, but because he says and writes things like this, quote, "Writing well isn't just a question of winsome expression, but having found something big and true to say, and having found the right words to say it in, of having seen something large and having found the right words to say it small enough to enter an individual mind, so that the strong ideas of what the words are saying Sounds like sweet reason. Sweet reason indeed, something we could all use more than a bit of right now. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming someone who I am extraordinarily proud to have as a regular guest and a friend to the Bayard Rustin Center for Social Justice Power Hour, the OG radical of the real, Adam Gopnik, folks. Please, thank you so much, Adam, for being here. What a thrill.
Robert, it's always a joy. You flatter me too much, and I'm sure I can't live up to it. And I also see that Cynthia is posting that you work like a fiend today. You are hardly waiting around for synapses to fire. And let me just say again as well that as always, your lineup is just shining. You know, Jim Henson is obviously one of those maverick American geniuses who we can never get enough of or see enough of. So it's wonderful too. And if I may say as well, you know, one of the things I love about the work you're doing is that it's comprehensive. You know, we talk about social justice, and we should, and we talk about the legacy of Bayard Rustin, and we have to. But that's a big legacy that takes in entertainment and pleasure as much as it takes in political action and organization. Central those are. So I really do love that. I thought, Robert, if you're up for it, if you can bear it, that we might talk tonight about three somewhat linked subjects. I am just back, and you can see the telltale bags under my eyes to indicate it. I am just back, jet lagged from France, from Paris, a city I love and have lived in for a long time. And I wanted to talk a bit about what I observed about pandemic politics and some broader politics while I was over there. As you know, I'm a Canadian by origin and certainly by hockey allegiance, if not by any other kind. And we just had a significant federal election in Canada, which I wrote about for the New Yorker magazine. And I'd like to talk about that a bit because I know that Americans, especially us lefty liberal Americans, admire Canada very much for things that are very admirable about it, like its national health insurance and its sanity about gun laws and so on. But we don't always kind of get an X-ray of the way that Canadian politics works. So I'd like to talk a bit about that. And finally, if you can bear it, I'd like to take a kind of a left turn, or maybe I should make that a right turn into traffic and talk about the latest revelations about the January 6th insurrection, the attempted coup, and why I think that all of our systems should be blinking a much brighter red and raising a much louder and shriller alarm than they seem to be doing right now.
I love all of that. I feel like, though, I should let everyone know we'll probably go to about midnight with all those topics. So, and please,
I will try and be succinct, and I will try to be a reporter in the first instance, bringing some news of a kind, rather than, my favorite writer. I have many beloved writers, and I'm lucky enough to get to write about them often. But if I have a single favorite, it's the great A.J. Liebling, who wrote about everything: war, D-Day, boxing, food, and the press for the New Yorker. And he once made one of my favorite distinctions between the reporter who tells you what he's seen, the expert reporter, or the interpretive reporter who tells you the meaning of what he's seen, and the expert who tells you what he hasn't seen. So I want to come before you at most as an interpretive reporter, not as an expert who tells you the meaning of what he hasn't actually seen. Fascinating thing, Robert. I'm a Francophile, unapologetically. I've written 2 books set in Paris, and I never miss a chance to get over. I'm acutely conscious of the deficits and the flaws and the crises in French society and civilization right now, and I want to talk about a couple as we go on tonight. But one of the things that was extremely impressive to my wife Martha and to me in this last trip, which took us over, I was doing some lecturing and other things, seeing the people we love, more important than anything else, was the sanity with which the French government has finally managed, I think, to cope with the pandemic, with the COVID crisis. One of the lessons, I think, and I think we've discussed this in the last over the last year, one of the humbling lessons, I think we should say, of the pandemic is that nobody quite figured out the right way to handle it. We made lots of wrong turns, and that was true about people of goodwill. I won't even go into what the people of ill will were prepared to do, but even people of goodwill started strong and then went wrong. I'll talk about it at a little greater length in a moment. But in my own native land of Canada, for instance, in the first months of the pandemic, Canada seemed to be doing far better than the United States. And I wrote a piece for the New Yorker about how the social capital of Canada, degree of civic trust that Canada still possesses, was a reason to explain how much better Canada was doing than the United States. Unfortunately, but the reality is the reality, Canada then took a terrible dip down, or I should say more tragically, a terrible spike up in infection rates and hospitalizations and so on. Much the same thing happened in France, which seemed to be able to handle the pandemic better than we could at the beginning, and then again took a terrible and dark turn, shut down Paris again last winter after the original spring shutdown, and so on. But what's fascinating to see is that we often criticize the French, or you will hear people in America criticize the French for being too statist, too dependent on centralized government. But it is notable and admirable that France now has a working system of what are, horrible phrase, vaccine passports. You have to get carte de santé, a health card, easily obtained. You have to show that you've been vaccinated, essentially, and that you're not currently infected. And when you have that, you show it to an agreeable person who stands at the entrance of every store and every restaurant and every bar. It's barcoded, just like groceries at Whole Foods or at any other grocery store. And they check your barcode, it works, and you walk in. What that means, of course, is that you don't have to be paranoid as you walk in about the safety, or relatively speaking, the safety of the place you're going into. No one, there are anti-vaxxers in France, as there are elsewhere, but basically this is a system that works extremely well. And it's a reminder, I think, Robert, of how much an outlier America is, we are, in terms of our attitudes about sane public measures. No one is inconvenienced. No one's liberty is infringed on. On the contrary, our liberty is replenished by the security that we can feel in entering into conversations with our friends. It's one of the things I write about at length in 1,000 Small Sanities, and we've discussed since, is the vital role that what Frederick Law Olmsted, another of my heroes, and the man who designed Central Park, called commonplace civilization, meaning all of not the big choices and decisions we make in the political sphere, but all of the little exchanges and the unexpected dialogues that we have in public and semi-public places, in libraries and coffee shops. These days, of course, more than anywhere else, here on the internet, here online, you and I have become, I hope I can say, close friends, regular interlocutors, just by talking to each other across either end of a Facebook link. So those are the vital connections that we make. And so having that carte de santé, which enables you to pursue it, enriches your sense of freedom, because it means you're not terrified of your neighbor or of your fellow citizen. And I think that that's so much not just the social practice of France, but the common sense of all of Europe, that it's a sad but helpful reminder of what an outlier the United States remains in its approach to those questions of public health and public welfare, and what a parched and insufficient conception of liberty we often allow to pass by. Liberty doesn't mean simply my freedom to assert myself. It means our freedom to connect without fear. That was the first thing I wanted to say. That's the good news coming out of France. The bad news, I'm afraid, is one that I've been reflecting on as well. And that is that though we all may be worn out with political populism or neo-fascism, choose your word, unfortunately, nationalist populism and neo-fascism are not yet through with us. The wave of ethnic nationalism, the politics of resentment and fear that have risen in the world in the last decade were, I think we all hoped, the tide might begin to turn against them with the defeat of Trump in our last election. I certainly wrote that, articulated that hope and wrote about it. But it's startling to see in France that once again a wave of a very dangerous kind of political populism, I'll call it neo-fascism, is on the rise. Almost everyone I spoke to whose political judgment I trust, or at least think to be generally insightful, sound, feels very strongly that in the French presidential election coming up next year in 2022, there's a very real chance that the extreme right will place a candidate on the final ballot. The French presidential election takes place in 2 rounds. That the extreme right will place a candidate on the final ballot, and that candidate will have a reasonable chance of winning. One of the names that's always mentioned is familiar even to Americans, I think, and that's Marine Le Pen, who's the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was the founder of the contemporary French extreme right and its party, the National Front. What's very odd and strange is that a Trump-like figure has emerged in France at the same time in the person of Eric Zemmour. And I tell you, I share that name with you with some trepidation, but also with some, I hope, not undue anticipation, because I fear that it's a name you're going to be hearing a lot more in the next 2 years. Zemmour is a writer, a journalist, a television performer who represents a form of extreme right politics that are well to the right even of the politics of the National Front. He is an unabashed worshiper of power. He is violently, I think it's fair to say, anti-Republican. He is above all a bigot. And part of the painful irony of his bigotry is that he himself comes from an Algerian Jewish family, but uses all of the conspiratorial tropes of classic French anti-Semitism against the Muslim minority of France, and vilifies the Muslim population very much as the Jewish population was once vilified. He's even engaged in a reevaluation of the Vichy government, the collaborationist government of the Second World War, insisting that it was serving France in a positive way, which is, to my mind, a staggeringly misconceived, or to put it mildly, idea. It's interesting, Robert, because one of the things in a kind of bitterly, mordantly ironic way, one of the things that made Trump work in America, I always thought, was that he gave the illusion of being a successful businessman, being a good businessman. And as we all know, millionaire businessmen are iconic figures in America. They're people who Americans have the habit of admiring. Now, Trump, as we all know, was never actually a successful businessman. He was a very bad businessman who inherited an enormous amount of money, which he then squandered, even managing to bankrupt a casino, which has never been done before. A casino is a license to print money, and Trump bankrupted a casino. Nonetheless, he impersonated a businessman successfully. And Zemmour, who's on the rise in France in a way that puts me very much in mind of Trump in 2015 in America, doesn't impersonate a businessman. He impersonates an intellectual, and he has a superficial grasp of history and of reference, which he uses. And just as we revere intellectuals, the French revere, I beg your pardon, as we revere billionaires, the French revere intellectuals. So as we are liable to fall for a billionaire impersonator, they are liable to fall for an intellectual impersonator. the deeper question, putting personalities aside, I think, is the question we keep coming back to again and again, which is why is this wave of ethnic nationalism, of populism, which is a polite word for what I think is more justly called neo-fascism, why it persists, and what its particular features are. And we could and should, and I hope will continue over the next year to discuss that and debate that. But I do think that one of the really striking features of it, Robert, I spent a lot of time on an airplane trying to think about how classic European fascism, the fascism of Mussolini, Hitler, of course, but also of Franco in Spain, Mussolini in Italy, and many other lesser figures, Salazar in Portugal, how it differed from this new form of nationalist authoritarianism. And it seemed to me that one of the things that's striking about it is that form tended to be aggressively imperialistic. This new form, they were out to conquer lands. They were out to conquer other people's countries. This new form tends to be much more inward turning, just as Trumpism was, America first. It tends to believe that we can somehow build a fortress that will protect the favored ethnic group against the intrusions of outsiders. So it's an oddly mediocre conception of a country. You know, one always felt that way about Make America Great Again. America was great. America was great. What that meant really was make America white, but also make America mediocre again. And that, I think, is a line that runs right through American neo-fascism, as I think we have to call it, and French neo-fascism, and its many branches and tentacles. And it reminded me again, as I was arguing in A Thousand Small Sanities, which I know is a book that you like, that we are in desperate need of a renewal of liberal and progressive politics, not just in renewal in the sense of seeing them in power, but renewing their rhetoric, renewing their understanding of themselves, restoring to them the fire that our mutual inspiration, Bayard Rustin, would have wanted for them. The day is not over. Or maybe I should say the night is not over. We are still in the midst of not just the pandemic, but of this pandemic of nationalist authoritarianism. So that was my trip to France.
I hope you got to eat some good food, though.
We did. We ate very well. In fact, let me add that we something interesting on that. I'm glad you asked me that. I live for good food. I love to cook, and you know, one of my greatest joys in Paris is to have a little kitchen somewhere with a window, and then go to the markets and buy the matchless fruits and vegetables. Which, by the way, you know, I talked a moment ago about, you know, we attack French statism, and there are times when French statism is an irritating thing. I wrote about that in Paris the Moon, about how often the French bureaucracy can move things from the real world into what I call the parallel paper universe, where things only exist in fiches and files on paper. It's a danger of abstraction. Camus, you know, is another one of my heroes. I'm talking about all my heroes tonight. Always said that was the greatest danger for French intellect, was the risk, the temptation of undue abstraction. So it's there. But the point was going to be is that one of the reasons why French strawberries and raspberries and peaches are so matchlessly delicious is because they're protected. They're protected by laws, by licensing of a kind, by regional protections. And without those protections, you know, one of the reasons that we don't eat as well is because we ship everything from one end of the country to another. Most often we make convenience, and we make supermarket survival our primary goal. The French don't, and they have government institutions that prevent that from happening. We can mock a food bureaucracy, but the fruits of it, all too literally, are wonderful. So we did eat very well. And I know the good thing, and the other thing I was going to say is, you know, we've been talking for the past year about the backward blessings of this pandemic, and God knows the backward blessings are this big compared to the horrible pain and suffering that this pandemic has caused. Just this week, I see, Robert, that we've crossed the line in which this pandemic, the 2020-21 pandemic, now has taken more lives than the Spanish flu, the influenza epidemic of 2019. Oh, yeah, can I throw something in here that's totally out of left field, but that might interest you? I mentioned that I went to Paris to give some lectures, and actually, what I was lecturing on was the life and work of Ernest Hemingway, the great American writer whose centenary, we were celebrating. It was exactly in 1921 that Hemingway moved to Paris for the first time. Went to live in Paris with his wife, Hadley. And so I was asked over to talk on the occasion of this centennial of Hemingway in Paris. And one of the bits of research that I ended up doing, and I've always joked that I've spent my life trying to beat the graduate student out of myself and have never entirely succeeded. So I have a graduate student's bad habit of researching everything. Anyway, one of the things I got interested in was whether or not Hemingway, we all know that Hemingway had a very acute and life-changing experience of the First World War, the Great War, as they called it. He was an ambulance driver in Italy, was very badly wounded by shrapnel, fell in love with a nurse in the hospital, and that became the basis for his great anti-war novel, A Farewell to Arms. But I was curious if he had been affected by the Spanish flu pandemic of that same period, because no one seemed to talk about it. And I did some digging and found out that, yes, indeed, he had. That, in fact, the same hospital where he was recovering from his war wound was a hospital where the people who were suffering from Spanish influenza, as they called it, from the 1819 flu, were being assembled. And his lover, his girlfriend, whose real name was Agnes, she's called Catherine in A Farewell to Arms, was called away from the military hospital to go to a pandemic hospital, a flu hospital. And Hemingway very painfully watched people, men, American soldiers, die not from their wounds, but from the pandemic. And it had a powerful effect on his mind because he realized that even if the world survived the war, there was always another kind of fatality that would come out after us. And his stoical sense of grace and his desire to take what pleasure we can in the world, what I call his Epicurean stoicism, to coin a needlessly complex but somewhat descriptive phrase, was rooted in that. So pandemics and plagues are things that have changed consciousness just as much as war has. The point I was going to make, though, was before I got off on that tangent, but which was pleasing to me because had this pandemic never happened, I don't think I would have ever asked myself how the previous one affected Hemingway. The point I was going to make is that there are, against all of the horrific suffering of the pandemic, a few backwards blessings. And one of them in Paris is that restaurants can no longer really afford the kind of grand expense account, 3-star dining, wonderful though that could be if you had somebody with an expense account to pay for it, and have turned to much more open bistro dining and to terraces, just as we have here in New York. So it's wonderful to walk down a Paris street and see all of those tables. There have always been outdoor cafes in Paris, of course, but now we have outdoor restaurants, and you still eat wonderfully and less expensively.
Now our viewers know two things. One is that my question to you wasn't flippant. It wasn't like, oh, did you eat good food? Because I know that you are such a Renaissance man in so many ways, that you've written extensively about food and you love food. And it's astonishing. And I hope that our viewers enjoy it as much as I do, but I don't think anybody could. The way that you will go down this path, and there will be 7, 8, 9, or a dozen or more tangents, and then you will always find yourself back at the original point. And that is an astonishing piece of work, my friend.
Well, I hope that I'm like the road runner, or rather like the coyote. I'm racing to keep up with my own tangents and digressions. But now, coming back to that question, right, which is the biggest question that faces us, is why are we living in this moment of renewed ethnic authoritarianism, which I am not afraid to call neo-fascism? And that leads me to the next subject I wanted to bring up.
If I may, though, before we move forward, we do have a question from a viewer asking if the French press is calling out this imposter.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Cynthia. And yes, they are. There are lots of people who are making exactly the point I've made. There's hardly a French magazine that doesn't have a cover story about the falsehoods and the lies of Eric Zemmour. He's actually, and because this is something that happens in France, he's been brought to trial on a couple of occasions for misrepresenting facts. It's against the law in France to engage in negationism. That is anything that attempts to deny the Holocaust. He hasn't done that, but he's been called to court on a couple of occasions. So yes, people know it. That's one of the big traps, though, isn't it, Robert? Is that we saw with Trump. It was a totally different personality type, except that the more you engage, the more you say these things you're saying are simply not true. Barack Obama was obviously born in Hawaii. We've gone through so much in the last 7 or 8 years, Robert, that we tend to forget that that's how Trump made his splash. That's how Trump made his entrance into the public world, was telling a completely crazy, transparent lie about Barack Obama's parentage. He told it. And the problem is with people of that kind is that, in a sense, the more you engage in exposing them, the more they enjoy it. The more you engage in exposing them, the more they repeat the lie. And the more that their following tends to think not, oh, I guess they're not telling the truth, but instead tend to discredit the truth tellers. That's how we get, the Trumpian perversion of the term fake news. If you remember, fake news first came about because there was pro-Trump fake news, manufactured news on Facebook and on Twitter and so on. And then Trump seized on that to call real news, honest reporting, fake news. And that's the way that the totalitarian, if you like, the authoritarian mind at least, always works. The more you engage, the more they enjoy it. And the more they, without a moment's shame or second thought, turn it against the truth teller. And that's a syndrome that's very hard to beat. And you see it. You saw it in America with Trump. Anyone who's prepared to lie on at a relentless pace, on a relentless level, is quite immune from being called out of it. I've been working on a piece, Robert, and I want to come to this before we finish tonight, about books about Trump and the election. And one of the things that's kind of staggering about it is that Trump goes from one lie to the next so readily, so easily, that at the end there's a kind of exhaustion factor that sets in. So yes, people have been calling out some more. They've been doing it for years. He's even, as I said, been called into court over misrepresentations of particularly the history of Vichy, but and Islamophobia and the rest of it. But it's an impotent gesture very often to engage with someone who's acting in fundamentally bad faith. Let me talk a bit, if I may, about Canada and the results in the Canadian election. I'm sure you remember that someone once was asked, there was once a kind of informal poll of journalists about what the most boring headline in the world was. And the winner was Worthwhile Canadian Initiative. As a Canadian, I recognize the painful truth of that. Canada can seem to be a dull country sometimes, though it pains me because I love Canada. I think Canada is in so many ways a model liberal democracy in its pluralism, in its ability to sustain very different founding communities, unlike America, where, for good or ill, we have a melting pot model where we all supposedly end up speaking the same language and so on. Canada, from the very beginning, has been built around 2 languages, 2 cultures, 2 religions, and so on, and new ones come in. Canada, let me say instantly, is far from a perfect country. I don't know how many of our listeners or how many Americans have been conscious of the residential schools scandal that's been exposed just in the past year. It's a terrible scar on the Canadian conscience about brutal schools where Aboriginal children were effectively kidnapped and forced to attend mostly Roman Catholic schools, and often were sickened and died. It's a terrible part of the Canadian heritage. And as I've often said, as I say in 1,000 Small Sanities, one of the things that liberal democracies are responsible for is implanting a corrective conscience in their own institutions. And the corrective conscience of Canadian democracy is challenged by the story of the residential schools. But the particular thing I wanted to talk about a little was the Canadian election had a particular kind of Canadian beauty, if I may say so, because it achieved total stasis. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, called an election. He has a minority government, a government in which he has his party, the Liberal Party of Canada, has the most seats in the Houses of Parliament, but not enough seats to win votes without the support of the smaller parties. And he thought he could, because he believed to have handled the pandemic skillfully at the end, he thought that he could get a majority, went to campaign, and found that he couldn't. And the composition of the Canadian Parliament after the election campaign is almost exactly, precisely what it was before the election campaign. It achieved a kind of specific stasis. That's a bad thing, one might think, but in some ways it's a reasonable thing. It represents the mood and opinions and beliefs of the country, and shows that they were fixed in place. Here's the significant thing that I thought was worth mentioning, because I think it gives us a powerful clue about the question of what is causing this avalanche of nationalist authoritarianism, with which we all live. Canada is a country in so many ways different than the United States, different in its history, different in its composition, different in its instincts, if I can use that term. Canadians have no history of, or very limited history of, civil war or civil disorder. They don't carry guns typically. They have stringent gun control. We could go on. And one of the things that's remarkable is that Canada has a very strong national health insurance scheme that is administered by the provinces, but is nationwide, a Medicare, which is extraordinarily successful and sound. I've been made acutely aware in the last few months of its excellence, because my own parents, who are now in their 80s, are still living in rural Canada, and they've been struggling, I'm glad to say, successfully so far, with all of the minor ills and outrages that flesh is heir to, and that people in their 80s are bound to suffer sooner or later. And they have gotten impeccable care, even in the midst of the pandemic, from the Canadian National Health System. Here's the fascinating thing, though, is that if you look at the evolution of Canadian voting over the past 50 or 60 years, there was a time when the rural vote, the backwoods vote, if you like, I say that with lovingly towards my parents who live out in the backwoods, was very much strongly resembled the urban vote, when there wasn't a significant, or it wasn't a vital disjunction between those two things. In fact, I just praised the Canadian National Health Insurance Scheme, as our friend Bernie Sanders does endlessly. You know, Bernie is always saying, why is it that in Vermont we're struggling with private insurance? We just have to cross the border into Quebec, and you have socialized medicine. You have health insurance for all. You have Medicare for all, and it works. And Bernie's right. But that National Health Insurance Scheme was originally brought in out west on the Western Prairies by a man who's a legend in Canada, kind of the Bayard Rustin of Canada, if you like, named Tommy Douglas. great Canadian politician. And Tommy Douglas was the leader of something called the CCF, which was a farm movement, Canadian Cooperative Farmers Movement. It was an agrarian movement. It was a radical movement out on the prairies, Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta, where the Depression in the 1930s had hit particularly hard. And I don't have to tell you, Robert, how much of the most vigorous and healthy strains of American radicalism in the 1920s and 1930s didn't come from the cities, but came from the prairies again, came from rural America here. You'll remember that the left-wing party in Minnesota is still called the Farm Labor Party because it involved a coalition of farm workers and labor workers. That was a very healthy part of the Roosevelt coalition, as it was in Canada. Now, though, what we're seeing is a radical disjunction of city voters and rural voters. And that's something that, if you look at it, that seems to be a rule right across Western Europe and the United States and Canada, is that there's never been this large a disjunction between the urban vote and the rural vote. And as I say, it's not historic, it's not built into some historical necessity. It's something specific that's been happening. And I'd be inclined to suggest or to argue that may be the single most powerful driver, the single most powerful propellant of the rise of nationalist authoritarianism that there is. It was responsible for Brexit in Britain, without question. It was that divide of city and rural vote. It was responsible for the rise of Trump in our own country. And it certainly seems to be acting as well in Canada now, and as it certainly has as well in France, the other country we've been talking about, where the Yellow Vest movement was a rural rebellion against the cities, also populist, also somewhat racist in some of its aspects, and so on. And I think that may be what future historians look back on 100 years from now as the distinguishing feature of our time. And if you think about it, Robert, we can sort of understand it. The disjunction between the experience of city dwellers, of urban people in the past 40 years from the experience of people who are still living in the increasingly impoverished and difficult rural world is enormous. And part of our job, and there's no one on the planet who's more a city boy than I am, but part of our work, I said back when that one of the things that we have to do is rethink the politics of progressivism. We have to rethink what radicals of the real have to do. And one of the big pieces of work I think we have to do is to think about bridging that rural and urban divide. It's not something that Democratic Party politicians talk about very much, but it is one of the driving propellants, as I said, of the rise of authoritarianism and the rise of exactly that urge to burrow in and to lock down, to live within a fortress all around the world, all around the Western world anyway. So in that way, though, the Canadian election may seem to have had almost a comic degree of stasis and non-movement within it. Nonetheless, that element, the way that even in Canada, highly rural country, that divide is weighing in, is, I think, a smoke signal, if you like, that we shouldn't ignore.
But there's been a lot of criticism, if I may, about that election because it cost such a great deal of money and yet, again, didn't move the needle at all, didn't do anything really to change the landscape. And do you feel it's worth that exorbitant amount of money that was spent to have this result that gives this same confidence?
Not change. No, look, I think almost everybody agrees that Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, made a mistake in calling the election because it changed nothing. It didn't move the needle at all. I would make a slightly contrarian argument, though, Robert, that one of the jobs of Democratic politicians is to try and seek a majority. it wasn't a vainglorious, necessarily a narcissistic gesture on his part. He thought he could win a majority, and minority governments are not good on the whole, I think, for even in parliamentary countries, because though they tend to compel people to moderate their policies and have to bring other people into coalition, it tends to blunt the possibility of significant change, because you're constantly having to negotiate with extremes. It clearly was a mistake, both politically and I think in terms of money's cost. And my Canadian family and friends, on the whole, regret it. But I can at least make a case that one of the things that a politician in a liberal democracy needs to do is to seek authority. And may I add too, that there were two previous conservative minority governments that were just as short-lived as this liberal minority government. So I think it was what did the great football coach Weeb Ewbank, if you remember him, probably don't, you're too young. He used to say, "His hindsight is always 20/20," and I think that's a bit of hindsight. Let me can in the little time we have left, Robert, if you can tolerate my gassing on.
You break my heart when you say such things as "if you can tolerate," or you also say "if you can bear." My friend, I could listen to you for this hour, for the next hour, for an entire evening.
Just listen to me for 5 more minutes, and I'd love your response to this.
There is a reason that when the New York Times asked Steve Martin who he wants to have dinner with, he named you. There's an absolute reason for that.
He just wanted the cooking. He wanted the cooking the conversation. I think, as I said, at the beginning, I've been reading this whole range of books. Frankly, we won this election about Trump by the Wall Street Journal, a whole range of books, Bob Woodward's new books about what happened in the last election and then in the aftermath of the election. And I genuinely fear, Robert, that we are all underreacting to what happened. What's become increasingly plain with every passing day is that, far from that being a kind of blundering, improvised temper tantrum on the part of a 2-year-old who we had the bad luck to see in power and in the White House, we were witnessing a well-organized attempt to end democracy in America. It's perfectly clear now that the blueprint that was being offered by a luminary of the Federalist Society was designed on January 6th to throw the count of the election, the electoral count, into a state of total chaos, deliberately intending to provoke response, howls from the Democrats, meaning demonstrations, marches, which could then be put down in a way that would justify martial law, which is what Flynn had been advocating for. This was a plan, Robert. It was a plot, and it was designed to create what Trump loved to create sufficient chaos to force an emergency, a crisis that would then be resolved in the classic authoritarian way by a military coup, in effect, or a Trump-led coup. We were incredibly lucky that this didn't happen. Mike Pence, who behaved well finally on January 6th, was shopping around looking for someone to tell him that he didn't have to behave legally, that he didn't have to obey the Constitution, that there might be an out. We've been reading about, and we read in Woodward's book, Woodward and Costa's book, that Dan Quayle told him he had no way out. Well, that's good for Dan Quayle, but he shouldn't have been asking. The very fact that he was asking shows that he was ready to do it if someone had given him license to do it. It's perfectly plain that the blueprint for stopping the electoral vote was completely arbitrary and almost comically manufactured. And yet, Robert, we are now in September from January, and no one has been held responsible for any of it. We clearly witnessed an organized attempt to overthrow democratic government in America. And the only people so far who have been held responsible for it are the low-lying fruit, if you like, the foot soldiers of the insurrection, those domestic terrorists, let's call them by their name, who invaded the Capitol on January 6th. I understand why, and I have tried to speak to some people who are in positions of greater, and anyone's in a position of greater power than me, but I've spoken to some people who are in positions of power. And the case they make, and I wrote a piece called Biden's Invisible Ideology, which your readers can, which your listeners, viewers can find on the New Yorker website, explaining that I know that one of the convictions of the Biden campaign and the Biden administration is that you lose when you play Trump's game. That is, if you respond to Trump's hysteria with any hysteria of your own, if you respond to Trump's lawlessness and attempts to overthrow the Constitution with your own politicization, so-called, of justice, it's a bad effect. That the wisest thing is to simply turn your back on it. There's a famous saying of Charlie Goldman, great boxing trainer of the 1940s, nobody makes up a game to get beat at it. This is Trump's game. He's not going to get beat at it. You will. I understand all those arguments, and I see their virtues. I think they're terribly mistaken. Cynthia just said, Attorney General Garland, where are you? And I think that's the big question that liberal, progressive-minded people have to be asking right now. I understand the risks of seeming to politicize the justice system. It is very unwelcome idea that we should indict members of a previous administration for fear of starting a cycle of indictment and counter-indictment. I understand clearly why that's a risk. But the much greater risk, I think, and I feel this so strongly having read all of these books now, the much greater risk is to allow that coup attempt to go by with impunity, to impose no penalties of any kind, to show no legal disdain, much less legal arraignment for them. I think that's hugely risky, and I think it's something that we will come back to regret. One of the things, and I will bring these remarks to a close, one of the things that critics of my book and critics of the kind of impassioned but incremental democratic liberalism that I believe in say is that you wimp out in a crisis. You wimp out in a crisis. And what I've always insisted on, it's why I love that phrase, which I know you like as well, radicals of the real, that we are radicals, but we try to do it in a realistic way. There are times when you cannot accept a cautious approach. I think that as I said at the beginning of this thing, read about what Trump was doing in last November and December and right up through January 6th, and your head, the top of your head will come off. We need accountability. We need accountability. And if seeking accountability risks our regular order, at this point, we have no choice. They weren't futzing around, indulging the temper tantrums of a 2-year-old. They had a plan for a coup to end democracy, which came this close to working. That's not tolerable.
I want to ask you, since you invoked his name, and I know it may not be a short answer, maybe it'll be for our next Power Hour conversation entirely. What are your thoughts on someone like Woodward, who has all of this information and chooses not to divulge it in a timely fashion, and basically for no more than book sales?
I've always been a critic of Woodward, and I've written about this. I wrote a piece back in 1994, if you can imagine, about the failings of the American press. And one of the things I pointed out is that Woodward basically runs, to be blunt, a kind of extortion racket. Because if you talk to Woodward, you're well treated. If you don't talk to Woodward, you're ill treated. And he adopts the point of view of the people who talk to him. Now, some of the people who talk to him are decent people and some are not, but he'll adopt their point of view. And yes, I agree with you, but you could extend it beyond Woodward and the media to ask about people like General Milley, people like General McMaster, and so on, all of whom, or Kelly, all of whom knew exactly who Trump was, who saw how reckless and dangerous he was, but they saved it to tell to the reporters for the books instead of stepping up when they had a chance and testifying at the impeachment trials or simply speaking up themselves. I know how dangerous that can seem and how difficult, but I think it's a problem. And let me add, I do think that it's a problem with all of these books, and I'll be writing about this in the next few weeks. The problem with all of these books is that the reporters get drawn into the Trumpian drama, and they choose to be entertained and amused by the extravagance of the impersonation, the extravagance of the outrages. And that, I think, is horribly difficult because all of these reporters end up going off to Mar-a-Lago and they can't believe that Trump is still talking to them. Of course, he's still talking to you. He's doing what con men call cooling the mark, letting you not get off enraged, but trying to placate you. We're not doing well, Robert, on the question of post-Trump politics. We're really not. And we got to stiffen our spines and act more aggressively.
And just so you know, I want to just shout out to our viewers. We talked about that at some length in our last episode when you were here, pulling the mark, and we talked about Ricky Jay, and we got into a nice little conversation about that. So if anyone wants to go back to our last Power Hour, it's a great.
Yeah, I threw it in there, but we explained it at length a month ago.
Yeah. So I love the fact there's always this tease that you give us that I'm writing about this right now. It'll be in New York in a few weeks. And I'm just waiting for the time when you get a little shout out to me in the Power Hour in one of these articles and say, I was talking to Robert Seder Schreiber. I'm just waiting for that. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it wouldn't be the worst thing.
All right. Yeah, we like to do that as writers. We like to introduce tiny little traces of the people we're fond of and the things we've done into our work. I always did that with my kids. Now I'll try and do it with you, Robert.
I'm just teasing. I love you so much. I have to say that, and I mean it so sincerely and so passionately as a friend. And I know I have, in all of my anxiety, which is great with a capital A, bad chemicals, as Vonnegut would say, one of the things I'm really secure in is how you and I actually are friends in not only the struggle, but in this journey together. And it means the world to me personally, and I know how much it means to our community and to folks here at the center. I know I hear from folks all the time how much it means to them that you're with us.
Well, it's this community, and our conversations are an incredible opportunity for me to find out what I think by hearing what I say. And I thank you for giving me that opportunity. And 2022 is going to be devoted to rectifying wrongs and finding you a home, finding the center home.
I like that very much, my friend. Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure, as always. I love being in the corner when you're talking for an hour. It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for this, and we'll see you next month because it's something I look forward to.
And I'll do now what I always do when we finish a conversation. Thank you for it, and then run off and cook dinner for my family. You
are such a beautiful man. Thank you. We'll see you soon, my friend. Great. All the best. Love to your family.
Love to you. Bye-bye.
So, my friends, that is the extraordinary Adam Gopnik, and here is the book. I want to show it to you before we leave for the evening, 1,000 Small Sanities, The Moral Adventure of Liberalism. If you enjoyed this, which you did, buy this book. Not only to support Adam, but to support yourself, because this book is such a great encapsulation of all you just heard and so much more. It's a beautiful thing. It's amazing to find someone who has so much heart and so much soul and so much thought put into almost everything they do. And that's what we do here as a community. Thank you all for being with us in virtual communion tonight. It means the world to us. So until soon, much love and respect. Until tomorrow night, we'll see you here at the Power Hour. We're here at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. We are here for you. Please be here with us. Much love and respect, y'all. Be good to each other. Be good to your families, chosen or otherwise. And most especially, my friends, please be good to yourselves. You need it, and we need you here with us.
We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers.